Welcome, friends. Welcome, Sir Peter. I'm Pat Basket. I'd like to say that this webinar will be recorded, is being recorded now, and subsequently will be available on our website. Please, you're automatically muted, but if you ask a question and unmute yourself, please don't forget to remute. I'm the former convener of our climate declaration. And as such, I would like to invite our new convener, Beverly Short, to open this webinar with a brief acknowledgement of our tangata whenua. Bev.
Ma te whakapono, by believing and trusting. Ma te tūmanako, by having faith and hope. Ma te titiru, by looking and searching. Ma te whakarongo, by listening and hearing. Ma te mahitahi, by working and striving together. Ma te whakamomori, by sheer desire and determination. Ma te aroha, by all being done with compassion. Kakaya e mato, we will succeed.
Kia ora, Bev. Thank you. I first heard Sir Peter speak about climate disruption in December 2013. He was, at that time, Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister. And he was the speaker at one of those Auckland Council meetings called Conversations. His presentation was, I think, one of the earliest ones to analyse and provide data specific to New Zealand. It included implications for the future. Now, 10 years on, I've invited him to update that presentation and those implications. Over to you, Sir Peter.
Thank you very much. Let me share the screen and start with hopefully that's working.
Yep, all go.
I've mused about what I would call this, and I want to really talk about, I've called it here a perspective from above and below, but I could equally have called it from denial, because climate change denial in 2010 was still very rife, to deferral, because what we're doing now is, while there's a debate about climate change, the issues around why we're not making progress on it are the issues that I really want to discuss. And I have to go back a long way, actually, in history to take us through why we're dealing with such a complex situation and not making a lot of progress. I do so wearing two hats. Obviously, I'm Director of KOI2, the Centre for Informed Futures in Auckland. But more importantly, perhaps, I'm President of the International Science Council, which is the world's principal body that interacts between the science community and the multilateral system. It's headquartered in Paris. It represents all the national academies, the scientific unions, the social science and natural science associations. And as you'll see, has bodies such as the World Climate Research Programme as part of its network. So I'll be talking a lot from the perspective of why we are not making progress, rather than analysing the particular impact on New Zealand per se. And I'm going to say some things which may be uncomfortable for some of you as I come towards the end of this talk. I think we need to understand that we're in a state of polycrisis. We have had pandemics, and we'll see more pandemics into the future. Obviously, this focuses on climate change, but there's many other aspects, as I'll talk about in a moment, for the sustainability crisis. The issues of social cohesion are right at the heart of some of the issues we're going to discuss. The issues of a failure of multilateralism, conflict and nationalism and populism are very key. The issues of living with technology are very real. And the issues of a loss of trust and the depowering of the nation state are also very relevant to how we solve this polycrisis that we face. I'm not going to dwell on this, except that to say that this new book that's out called 3 Degrees More by the German group, largely from Potsdam, and it's free on the internet, is a very powerful book. And this is from Stefan Ramsdorf, who many of you will know. Stefan Ramsdorf is one of the gurus of climate change, pointing out where we are and that we're in a real rapid phase of acceleration. And the probability of staying below 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees Celsius is virtually zero. I hate to say it, but that's the reality. And it will take some time before we level out, probably closer to 3 degrees or thereabouts. And of course, in that same period, we've seen in the last 100 years, we've seen about a 15-centimeter rise in sea level around the world, and it continues to rise unabashedly. Now, all of that's well known, it's well described. There's with some minor issues around the modeling. There's no real debate about the numbers that are there. What I think is more important is to think about the range of impacts. And again, this comes from the same book from Potsdam, who've been so much at the center of thinking about these issues, about the obvious ways in which climate at 3 degrees affects heat, water scarcity, floods, extreme weather, but more importantly, looking at the consequences from productivity, food security, health, infrastructure, and the costs that that brings to society. And you're going to see me emphasizing a lot about the cost to society because we need to understand why we're not getting action. And in the same analysis, they pointed out that if we get to the order of 2.5 degrees, we're seeing a 10% impact on global GDP. If we get up much higher, we're going to see enormous impacts on GDP. And that, I think, is very salient to the kinds of discussions that need to be had. Now, if we think about the climate agenda, and this is very relevant to what we're going to talk about, the real start of the climate agenda was when in 1980, the World Climate Research Programme was established as a partnership between the World Meteorological Organization and what was then called the International International Council of Scientific Unions, I've typed it out wrong, which is the predecessor to the International Science Council, which I now chair. That led to a conference of scientists between the United Nations Environment Programme, the World Meteorological Organization, and the International Science Council in 1985, which insisted that the multilateral system needed to take climate seriously, and that led directly to the formation of IPCC and the UNFCCC, and that led on through the various activities which are so important, the Kyoto Protocol, the Stern Report, the SDGs being agreed and climate action being SDG 13 in 2005. And we're now at another critical phase where this year, later in the year, in September this year, will be the first midterm review of where we are in the SDGs, looking at what's called the Summit for the Futures and the Pact for the Futures, which is going to be the next UN declaration in this space. Obviously, the sustainability agenda is high, and last year the UN Secretary General announced that this would start of a decade of science for sustainability, which is being led by UNESCO with the International Science Council, which I chair as its primary partner. And what may be also relevant is the International Polar Year, which is the 5th International Polar Year in 2032, will bring to the fore a lot of the issues both in the Arctic, the Antarctic, and in the glacier, the third pole of the Himalayas and other mountain chains. But if you take the same summary and interface that with some key multilateral agenda items, you can see that what happened was it was really in the period after Glasnost and the Berlin Wall falling that we made progress towards a global agenda. First, the Millennium Development Goals, and then the Sustainable Development Goals, about which I'll say much more in a moment. And that's when we had the Paris COP. But then in 2017, that short period of 20 years of multilateral stability and a consensus to work together was broken. And since that time, the ability to have global conversations around these poly-crisis issues has been consumed by geopolitical and geostrategic conflicts, which are getting in the way of the very conversations the world needs to have. And right at the beginning of all of this, when the SDGs were formed in 2015, we were saying what's got lost in all of this is understanding that climate cannot be looked at in isolation, that there's a large number of interactions between climate and other parts of the sustainability agenda writ large, which need to be taken into account if we're going to make progress. And I think it was very unfortunate because in the last few years, both the policy focus has been somewhat narrow, and equally the science agenda has been dominated by the physico-chemical and the technological, when most of the issues that are inhibiting progress are sociological, cognitive, I'll come back to that in a moment, and political. And we needed to use science, which we did not do well, to understand the barriers when inhibiting progress. Now, this is an unusual illustration of the Sustainable Development Goals, but actually the one that I like best. It comes from colleagues of mine in China, Jinghai Li, who is probably the most distinguished scientist in China, who pointed out that if you look at the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, 6 of them were about, or 5 of them were about defining the essential needs that we need to extract from the system, from the global system, food, water, energy, resources, and from land to provide us with what we need to survive. On the other hand, as societies, we have a whole lot of wishes to maximize our reality and our well-being. We don't want poverty, we want to be healthy, gender equality, safe societies, etc., etc. And to a certain extent, there's a tension between extracting a lot from the world to make these things optimized and minimizing extractions of the world to protect the planet for the future. And so you have the set of intermediates, including how we manage climate, which is how we try and actually manage this distribution between extracting from the planet and on the one hand to meet our well-being needs and not extracting from the planet to sustain the planet's future. This is a very powerful way of thinking about the SDGs. The other thing to point out in this is when we talk about sustainability, we're not just talking about food, water, energy, climate. We're talking about equality, safe societies, education, health, eradication of poverty. This is what the world signed up to, and it's that which needs to be borne in mind. But every few years, the International Science Council, on behalf of the UN, appoints a panel to review progress against the SDGs. And without going into a lot of details, you can see there are not a lot of greens, a lot of greens which says we're making progress. What we've got is a lot of red saying we are failing on this agenda because of the geopolitical and other tensions I raised before. The other way of looking at this, which I think is important, is, as you'll all be aware, Johan Rockström, who's now at the Stockholm Environment Institute, came up with the concept of planetary boundaries, which were geophysical. And then that was extended by Kate Raworth to point out that you cannot look at the biophysical parameters in their isolation from thinking about the social parameters that also need to be taken into account. because we've got to be realistic. People need to live. And so the donut model which Kate came up with, which is shown on the right, actually, without going into the details of whether the modeling is right or wrong, points out that we're really in crisis on both the biophysical, as Rockstrom pointed out, and in crisis on the sociological, as I think we're all aware. So there are some critical questions that come from this kind of analysis, and I'm being very rapid and superficial on what is a lot of work from very fine thinkers. Why can we not think long term? Why do we not think intergenerationally? Why do we not, and when I mean we, I'm talking about the global community, and have we increasingly become mismatched to the world that we've created? In other words, are we now living in ways beyond the capacity of the world to actually cope with? And underneath all of that, we have to ask, what are the barriers? And once, I'm not advertising a book, which is probably not directly relevant, I actually wrote a book about the unintended consequences of human innovation. You can actually argue climate change is fundamentally the unintended consequences of human innovation in the 19th century, leading to a fossil fuel-based energy production system, highly unintended, and we're now paying the consequences for it. And there are many actors and interests involved in trying to address these issues, from the multilateral system with all its failings, to individual governments with all their failings, to the science, research, and technological communities, to civil society, which is by no means unitary in the way it looks, and then to individuals and families who themselves may have different perceptions, and then the role of the private sector as a whole. And all of these interests and actors need to be considered in finding the solutions. And I hope you can see this, because I regard this as a very valuable analysis, which again comes from the Global Sustainability Development Report of last year, that points out there are really 6 related transformations that we need to think about: human well-being and capabilities, sustainability and sustainable and just economies, sustainable food systems and healthy nutrition, energy decarbonisation with universal access, urban and peri-urban development. Now the majority of the world's population is urbanised, and obviously the global environmental commons, including climate change. And then on the horizontal axis, on the vertical axis, they point out the 5 classes of levers that need to work together if we're going to make progress. Governance, whether it's at the multilateral or the natural system, the business sector, the economy and finance. Remembering we're talking about potential hits to the GDP of 10% to 20%. Role of individuals in collective action, where I know that's where many of you are coming from. The role of science and technology, which is where I come from. And the issue of capacity buildings across the whole system, the role of education and capacity building so that we can meet these challenges. And I think it's by looking at a matrix like that, you can see the complexity of making real progress. So I focused in my last few years on the issues of what science is needed to make real progress, on the broader sustainability agenda, of which climate is an integral part, but cannot be looked at in isolation. And this led to actually 4 years' work of the International Science Council working with experts from both global north, south, east, and west that come up with the kinds of ways in which we need to find actionable knowledge, solutions-focused, common good science, which is transformative, which is transdisciplinary, in other words, engaging with other knowledge systems, is systems-focused, globally and regionally connected and collaborative. I won't go into all the details, but this report has been very influential and is being very influential globally in thinking about changing the science system to meet the objectives that are needed. And in this, we produced a report, which I wrote with a colleague from Bergen, on the future of the kind of research that's needed, which must engage with other knowledge systems, including Indigenous knowledge, and a report that was presented to the UN last year at the High Level Political Forum on the need to flip the science model. And we've had a commission headed by Helen Clark, who you all know, and by Irina Bukova, the former head of UNESCO, actually moving towards finding global funding systems to actually do the research that's really needed. So what are the issues that are making this knowledge we have about climate science actionable? Well, the first problem is, how do we get beyond short-term thinking? Obviously, the centre I lead is focused on long-term thinking, but if you think about the whole way democracy now works, it's focused on the short term. If you think about the news cycle, the expectations on immediate responses, the whole system is now focused on short-termism, which is ironic because originally democracy was probably intended to protect long-term thinking, but in the last 20 years has become very short-term. Secondly, we've seen this large rise of political polarization around the world, most evident now in Europe in the last few days, which means that the centre of politics is hovering out to the ends. And by definition, politics has become far, far more contentious between the two polar ends and less able to become collective in the middle. When did you last really see true central bipartisanship at work on major issues? There's a fundamental issue which I've written about in this report, which is you can see on the right here, between it's easy for people to state there's a risk of earthquakes, or there's a risk of of floods, or a risk of big storms, and producing the knowledge that's needed for the policymakers to know what they should really do. And then a further set of gaps between that and them actually doing it. Because there are all sorts of political and cognitive biases against working for the long term. Ultimately, politics all the time forces them, because their constituencies want short-term answers to immediate issues, when they actually would like often to be working on the long term. Furthermore, they tend not to get credit for things that may not have implications for 20 years, where they get credit for what they do immediately. And then when things get too complicated, it's actually rational to it's too hard, let's not think about it. And there are problems like that crop up in politics all the time. It doesn't mean we're talking about the left or the right. It's just rational if things are very hard and you can't do much about them, not to try in our political system. This issue of time preferences is very real. By time preferences, I mean, how far into the future are you thinking? The various sociological and communication changes with social media and what else, changes from a deliberative informed media to an infotainment kind of media, have led to shorter and shorter time preferences, which in itself means that there's an increasingly focus on the short term rather than the long term. And I think around the Western world, there's a general lack of a willingness to understand that just as other parts of stewardship, such as being prepared for civil disasters, being prepared, having defence system, etc., foresighting the future must be seen as a core part of stewardship. And my team is actually working with the UN now at their request on a report on how we make anticipatory foresight a more core part of government decision making, because it's about making decisions now that shape the future towards a better range of possibilities. And then the last two issues that are difficult, which really relate to this polarization issue, are the issues of social inclusion and social cohesion. And I think we're seeing all around the Western world for a variety of reasons, a fracturing of social cohesion. And some of you will know that's the major area in which I work now, is how we restore social cohesion. And because if you don't have cohesion, you cannot get agreement on what to do with these complex systems problems. And that's why you saw the tension, and then what was the parliamentary protest of last year, which was driven initially by anti-vaccine mandate individuals. You saw people who were, shall we say, resistant to the kinds of changes that might be needed with climate change get involved in the discussions. Now, another aspect to it, which I think is going to turn out to be really important that we have a more complete conversation about, is the role of technology. Digital is a paradox. Digital will offer some partial solutions, but now digital technologies are the most rapid reason for the rise in energy use around the world. Big data, LLMs, AI are all driving an enormous burden on the energy demands in the Western world. Perhaps up to 10% of digital demands are now related to the enthusiasm for AI. Carbon capture technologies are talked about, but frankly, they're a long way from being able to deal with the issues that need to be dealt with. Battery energy and transport technologies are developing at a pace, but they have a cost to them. Obviously, the issues in batteries are now about mineral extraction, resource extraction, so it creates a different kind of sustainability issue. Methane inhibition is of interest to New Zealand in particular, but there's methane coming from the permafrost, warming from oil wells, etc., etc. But methane inhibition from New Zealand's perspective is very important. But again, it raises issues that some people may or may not like it, what some of the technologies that might be involved. For instance, GM crop development for crops that might inhibit methane production. Genetic technologies are clearly going to have a major role in how we address food production and sustain it without growing energy use and explore and reduce it and further deforestation. So there's some real issues globally there. And while I hope we never need it, the reality is, if that first slide I showed you is right, then the issues of solar radiation modification, which is a fancy way of saying geoengineering, cannot be ignored. But we have no processes in the world that would decide how and when, under what circumstances would we use it, even though some early technologies exist that may or may not be safe and may or may not be useful. But there's been a resistance to discussing them because it's thought it would inhibit mitigation efforts. But it takes 10 or 20 years to develop a technology. And if the world needs it and we don't have it, we'll be in even further trouble. And so again, discussion is starting at the level of the United Nations Environment Programme, International Science Council, across the world, on how we would actually make decisions in that space if we ever needed to have it. The other problem that we have to face is, while the Western world may be energy rich in its use, much of the world, Africa in particular, has a right to a better access to energy. And so this issue of energy use and utility and production and technologies is going to be, it is at the heart of a number of issues that are on the table. So why can't we have a consensual conversation and solve some of these problems? Well, the geostrategic issue is real. At the moment, when all the enthusiasm for addressing it with the Kyoto, Paris, Millennium Development Goals, there was the level of geostrategic tension was much less. The China-US tension had not emerged. The Russia-Europe, Russia-US tension was not there. We're just after Glasnost. Now we're in a very geostrategically complex period where the ability to maintain and build relationships over the very science and data and solutions that are needed is hard. I've talked about the biases towards the short term. I've alluded to the tension between different views of the issues between global north and global south. And lastly, I'll talk about the fact that both domestically and internationally, we've ended up with polarized discussion between those who advocate in a rather angry way, we must do this now, and those who have interests in other ways that are more interested in the immediate term. And we need to find a way to have a much more less polarized and collective discussion if in the end we're going to make progress given the various actors in play. And I think this issue of polarization and populism, which is my bottom-up component as opposed to the multilateral bit, which I've talked about at you earlier, is key. What we've seen is that the nature of civic discourse has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Rhetoric and anger have replaced principle and policy discussions and policy and dominating the discussion. Sorry for the typo. Democracies are suffering as opposition has become visceral and reactive rather than policy-based. And yet we know that yelling at each other doesn't work. We know that hyperbole doesn't work. And yet that's where the discourse has gone. It needs to be understood that every society since the last 20,000 years has a mix of communitarians and individualistic people. Roughly, you might see that in the way people have different views of economic models between the left and the right, but it's much broader than that. And democracy is designed to incorporate this mix of people, which it varies. I don't want to estimate what mix is which, because many people sit in the middle. But we need to understand that every society has a mix of people that need to work and agree how to work together. And in this context, finding a way ahead will not be achieved by ignoring the diversity of interests that these different actors had. And what we need is to find realistic ways to achieve advantage for everyone. And that's hard. And that's the kind of discussion that needs urgently and should have been had over the last decade. We're going to need systems changes. And we need to work out what are those changes and what's possible and what's acceptable. I'm not going to dwell on this in length, as I've already said it, but we do need to find a way to get beyond the polarized narratives between the short term and the long term, between the communitarian and the individualistic, between those who would rather defer and hope that technology solves it, to those who know that we need to act more immediately. We need to find a common narrative. This is the argument that those of us who work in social cohesion theory think about a lot. We are all part of the same human species. We all live on the same planet. We all breathe common air. How can we create a narrative that's common? And one of the most interesting things has been work that we did on behalf of the United Nations Development Programme of thinking about human development. And I don't mean human development in the pediatric sense, but in the economic sense, in a much broader context. And this volume pointed out that now we need to think not just in economic terms about human development, but in terms of environmental and ecosystems thinking as much as everything else. And we need to think about all the dimensions, and we need to do it in a much more constructive way if we're going to make progress. Now, finally, I want to come to New Zealand. New Zealand's place in a warming world. At one level, we're small, largely insignificant in terms of the overall biophysical impact that we have on the long-term trend for rising global temperatures. Having said that, we might be more significant in the shorter term because of the methane production that we do, although in terms of the total methane production, it's fossil fuels and it's permafrost and rice paddies, which are very important. And we have, over the last few years, tried to take some leadership. For example, the 2010 Global Research Alliance on reducing pastoral agricultural greenhouse gas emissions was an early attempt to be a global leader. And I think a lot of credit needs to go particularly to Tim Grosser at the time for leading a charge to try and address this issue of agricultural emissions while maintaining food production. We know we're economically and socially vulnerable to climate change, as are our Pacific neighbours. And importantly, and I refer you to this work that was done, oops, sorry about that, by Anne Bardsley, my deputy, and others, on New Zealand's climate change risk assessment framework, which highlights in particular the risks to New Zealand beyond the obvious economic impacts, which I've written about before, but on social cohesion. But on the upside, we have the potential to have an influence far greater than our absolute size. We're less polarised than most societies, although we're at risk. We know that New Zealand has had environmental and heritage issues on the political agenda at least since Matapuri in 1972, and so that we're able to have those discussions in a way that few countries are. Our economy is shaped more like that of developing nations, and that allows us to be credible in thinking through issues than the Global South has. We're multicultural, we're small, and that gives an advantage if we can work out how to have national conversations. But on the other hand, unfortunately, sustainability writ large has never been part of the domestic policy framework. I've argued that a sustainability commission would have been far more likely to be effective than a climate commission because it would have looked more globally at climate as part of this complex network of interaction. We would be a valuable place for the testbed for a number of technologies, but we still have a relatively immature view of how we look at technology assessment. I've shown you the slide before, but I want to end with this in the next slide and pointing out that you cannot look at climate alone from thinking about the fact that we do continue to need to extract essential needs from the ecosystem. And we need to balance that about the demands that we have, which may be utopian, but they're demands that we all agree with. And in the middle, we have these issues that need to be, including climate, that have to be compromised, and we have to work our way through how we manage between these two extremes of inputs and demands. And it's a really complicated situation when you only look at it in part and in isolation. So in summary, and this is my last slide, actionable knowledge will change to change the trajectory of global warming needs to impact on citizens locally, create narratives that bring consensual action, affect policymakers nationally, and drive nation states to collectively understand that it's in their national self-interest for effective global action. That's the reality of geopolitics, that you're not going to persuade countries to be altruistic for the sake of the planet, but you will they will act altruistically when it's in they see it's in their interest, in their own self-interest to work together on climate change. This is the singular biggest challenge for multilateral diplomacy. The other challenge is domestic, and it's how to address climate change in a way that maintains social cohesion rather than promotes fragmentation to, and reactions to or accusations of alarmism. Neither scientific data alone nor extreme yelling will change the future. We need to find a way to do it collectively. We must address the political realities that all citizens and politicians need to accept the trade-offs and choices that need to be made. And how to change the conversation with all the actors while maintaining a democratic ethos will be central to effective progress in New Zealand and other democratic countries addressing climate change. I'm going to stop there. I've gone a bit longer than I meant to, and I apologize for a few typos on the slides, but they were produced on an aeroplane a few hours ago.
I'm sure that, like everything else, you will succeed in fixing them. So we thank you for that. Quite mind-boggling, really. It's a lot to take in, and in a sense, you articulate what a lot of us who've been working in kind of different areas in this field know about, but don't quite know how to put together. In other words, it's not just that the weather's getting worse or the temperatures are going up, and nor is it just the planetary boundaries, and the donut won't save everything, right? That is trying to make sense of it all is the enormity of the problem. However, we have to start somewhere. And I liked your ending where you say that New Zealand is really a good place to start. And if only we had the courage and did start. New Zealand has a place in the world, not only because of the All Blacks, but we do punch above our size. And therefore, I would like to ask a question or make a point that if our government had the courage to enact a policy or a raft of policies that were stronger than the rest of the world, and that we showed how they can be done and bring everybody on board, then we will be doing something. And in fact, it's a kind of cliche of climate activist thinking to look back to World War II, and where fear of the future enabled the government to bring in all kinds of policies which enabled the survival of society at that time. And so I want to know, I mean, there was rationing and all kinds of things. I'd quite like to have there to be rationing of oil so that it was there and plastic for those who really needed it. So are we, in fact, in New Zealand and other places, are we holding, is data and science being held to ransom by politicians because of the short term? How do we get the message across? And we're not frightened enough, is my point. Sorry.
Well, I think at the end of the day, Pat, the whole system is designed for the short term. It wasn't originally designed for the short term, but it's now by the context of the media, social media, the way we expect our politicians to have magic answers, and we don't have. And we have a relatively, and I mean this not unkindly to any politician or any bureaucrat, we have a shallow system where we can have rapids because we don't have the layers of checks and balances in our system that some other systems of governments have. However, I think the reality is that the old cliche, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, is real for politicians all the time. And therefore, until you actually find a way to meet the interests of the different stakeholders involved, be them private sector, be they farmers, be them whatever, and I'm not picking on any of those groups, we're not going to get the politicians to vote for what they need to do. Now, we've had attempts. I mean, New Zealand has taken leadership in this area once, and while it perhaps hasn't met its promise, it shows what we could do. And that goes back to what is probably relatively unknown, the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Emissions, which was set up in 2010 in New Zealand. Originally, 33 countries came here. I led the scientific discussion. David Carter was then Ministry of Agriculture, led the political discussion. And some 33 countries, now about 65 countries, are members of an alliance which has worked on the big issues of soil and carbon measurement, on issues of methane science, on rice paddy production of methane, on livestock management. And New Zealand largely funded it. New Zealand funded the Secretariat and so forth. It brought in the Americans, it brought in the Chinese, it brought in the Russians, it brought in a number of global. Now, unfortunately, I think it's too small and we didn't have enough grunt, and it might have, and there were competing players who didn't like the fact that perhaps New Zealand was taking the lead here. I won't go into the politics of it. But in fact, we have taken somewhat of a lead from time to time. It's not as if, and that was with a John Key government, not with a centre-left government. So we can do things and take a lead.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from Joanna Santa Barbara.
You're muted, I think.
Yes, I think Jim was before me, Pat.
Oh, sorry. Where is Jim? Okay.
Hi, Jim.
Okay. Who first?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Jim. Sorry not to have picked you up.
Yep. Thank you, Sir Peter. And I sent you.
I think you should call me Peter, Jim. After all these years.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, we knew each other back in student days in Dunedin. There's just 3 points I want to make or have you comment on. Firstly, there's a very good collaborative model that's existed since the 1950s. I mean, it was simple because it was all around numerical weather prediction. And so the World Met Organization basically established free interchange of, it was those days, weather balloon data amongst all the nations of the world. And this has continued to the fact that there's incredibly free interchange of a lot of climate and weather data and everything, and it's still going on today. The thing is, everybody puts in and everybody takes out, and the US are usually very generous. So that's the first point. The second thing is it's difficult when it's the human condition. The goal we want to reach to is reduce emissions, which is way out there in terms of time, and yet so people freeze and think, oh, how the hell I get to? So we're really going to have to take it, okay, that's the goal, but this is what we need to do this year, next year, and so on. In other words, have all the small steps. And finally, I noticed how Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough joined together, and that was a very powerful force. So Sophie Hanford, who got 170,000 school kids, she was 18 at the time, out on climate strike, and we joined together to form an intergenerational group of climate activists, and that's worked very well because you get input on all the generations concerned, and what the Zoomers, which are those who are reaching 20 now, have quite a different perspective on the planet and what they're going to inherit than quite a lot of us are here, probably baby boomers. But that has worked out to be very powerful. So those are just thoughts you may wish to comment on.
Well, yes, not really, because I don't disagree with any of it, except that I think that in the current geostrategic situation, we're seeing a push back. Open as necessary, as closed as needed. And we're seeing a reduction in the amount of shared data science going on around the world. I think that's beginning to become quite an issue in the global science arena. It hasn't impacted so much yet on the climate situation, because I think, to be frank, that's not the science that's urgently needed. We pretty much know what's going to happen in terms of global warming. I think it's other things that are more complicated. I think the last point is important, but don't it's interesting because in
Mm.
fact, we do a lot of work surveying what worries young people within Koi2. You'll be surprised, most of the worries are about, will I have a job? More about, their worries when you actually ask them in confidence rather than in group are not that different to the worries we had when we were young. Yes, of course, climate change worries them. And we didn't know about climate change when you and I at university together. But they still have this bias towards the short term, like we do. I think the more interesting phenomenon, and you'll have seen it in the work of Sophie Howe, who we brought out to New Zealand last year, and people like that, is how do we actually encourage commissions for intergenerational thinking, arrangements that focus on the long term in general, and make it more broad than just climate in a narrow sense. Because as I tried to say in my talk, climate is part of a broader set of long-term issues. And I think you're seeing around the world, we've been involved a little bit. I argued, as those of you who had read my report on Auckland, that we should have a commissioner for future generations appointed to Auckland City. I think every city in New Zealand should have a commissioner for future generations. I think that we should have a system for future generations within our long-term thinking structures. At least we have the Climate Change Commission. We now have an Infrastructure Commission. Early seeds of long-term thinking structures removed from the immediacy of partisan politics. But we're not there yet. And I think that there's quite a move. Those of you who read the book, The Good Ancestor, some of the other books that are around on long-term thinking, will see that there is a gradual move in public policy to try and think of institutions that will promote intergenerational. Now, that's not going to solve the problem that we need to do things now, but it changes the political mindset in which policymakers can make decisions. And I think we need to understand policymakers are constrained by what they think their constituencies will agree to. And that's how they work.
Thank you. Joe, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. So Peter, I wonder if I can ask you to comment on your thoughts on the relationship between social cohesion and economic inequality of wealth and income.
Oh dear, I could spend all the next 2 days talking to you about that. I mean, if I can be rude and refer you to the website, www.informedfutures.org. Informed Futures is one word, .org. And just search for the reports on social cohesion there. You'll see a large number of reports that we've written on this. The one which was written last year highlights the different elements that we think are involved in undermining social cohesion. There's no doubt that inequalities of different kinds, economic, health, educational, gender, etc., all drive a loss of social cohesion. But there's many other factors involved as well. And we're actually doing work with Treasury now on some of this. For example, what does fairness mean? Is life what fairness means different things to different groups of New Zealanders. And so we use words that have different meanings to different people. And that makes the conversation difficult. And you'll see we'll be launching on July the 9th, making an announcement of what we think is the way ahead in this whole area. We have no way in New Zealand at the moment of consensual conversations on difficult matters. It becomes immediately polarized or politicized. It's even before, I mean, if you just take what happens when the government makes even the day after the election, before they've done anything, they're being attacked. Or the day after, an hour after the budget, before anybody's read the budget, it's being attacked. We go immediately into contentious politics on matters which are fundamental to New Zealand's future. And there are techniques now available They're
Yes.
very sophisticated techniques, from citizens' assemblies to hybrid fora to digital techniques, which are very sophisticated for having civil conversations on complex matters. And these very wicked problems, be it intergenerational disadvantage, the housing crisis, how we respond to climate change, need that kind of conversation removed from the immediacy of partisan politics. Yes, in the end, it's the political system that makes a number of decisions. That's why we have a democracy, but we don't have fora. So we are announcing what we're calling the Koitu Forum on July the 9th, from memory, yes, July the 9th, which will be the whole apparatus that we're pulling together to both conduct citizens' fora and digital techniques on these very complex issues. And I won't break the announcement open now, but I think it's 11 very distinguished New Zealanders from across the whole political and ideological spectrum have agreed to be the guardians of it, to make sure that it stays a non-partisan, non-political way of having a discourse on these very complex matters, which I believe have to be. One of the questions in the chat was about grand coalitions. Well, the way to get a grand coalition is actually to have our citizens come to a grand coalition by coming to the centre than going to the extremes. And that's what this is all about. Now, there's some other obvious issues that New Zealand's confronting at the moment, which are very difficult. But I think the ones that I've talked about now are the ones where we can make progress. So watch the space, because I think it's going to be quite a circuit breaker for these conversations.
We certainly will be watching that space. Thank you. Jack, you have your hand up. Unmute. Yep, Jack.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, your last comment was much more encouraging than your earlier comments. So thank you very much for the action on citizens' assemblies and those other deliberative democracy initiatives. They're clearly essential to deal with the polarization and
it's the only solution I can think of.
It's clear. I'm curious as to some of the issues that will be addressed or perspectives that will be created for that environment. One of the things that often occurs to me is that so much time is spent on what is politically feasible, because of so many of the issues that you've outlined. And we seem to spend less time on what is ecologically necessary to actually continue the biosphere functioning in the way that has supported us in the past and needs to going forward. Because it seems to me that considering, and I'm curious how you would view this perspective, that trying to understand, based on the science, what the necessities require us to do in terms of our relationship with how we extract resources and how we exude waste. The scope, the scale, and the speed of disrupting of these ecosystem services, we have pretty good science on that from a variety of different perspectives, different methodologies, different approaches. They triangulate well. We are way, way over anywhere near where we should be. But yet most people don't understand the magnitude of the issues that we face and the amount of change that's required. And it seems to me that, on the one hand, you don't want to scare the ponies, but on the other hand, if people don't understand the necessity and the urgency of dealing with this disruption, they're going to be less motivated to make the kinds of compromises that are necessary to deal with it. And if I just add one other issue with respect to the goal of the deliberative democracy, there's the issue of the common good. It's not only the processes that we need to consider and the interest of these various parties. It's not a matter of balancing and compromising. It's a matter of what are our ethics? What do we actually value? And I would just hope that that's going to be included in the initiative that you've outlined. And I wish you every success with it, obviously.
Well, look, I don't disagree with anything you said or the intimations in it, but I'll make a couple of points. The first is the science is well known and understood, but the very barriers I alluded to, willful ignorance, cognitive biases, it's too hard to understand. It's better not to understand because it's too hard to know what to do, is a natural evolved bias. I got at cognitive, I think it was COP26, and I should say I only go to COPs by video. I refuse to go to them in person. The biggest waste of time, of energy I can think of to go to in person. I spoke and said, immediately after Johan Rockstrom, actually, I said, look, the science we need is not knowing what the glaciers will do in 2200 or 2300. It's how do we overcome these cognitive biases that make us focus on the short term, don't allow us to actually take the knowledge we have and try and use it. And I think that's very real. And I think that still remains, and we're working on that internationally. And I come back to the point which I made in my last slide, I think it was, you actually alluded to it in your comments. We need a high level narrative about what we all have in common and what we share, and the altruism that comes. And if you know evolutionary biology, you know the evolution of altruism actually is from vested self-interest and understanding that reciprocation and kinship are the things that drove altruism. And so we need to find, and I don't want to go an advertisement for a book, but if you read this week's Listener, there's an article about Harvey Whitehouse, who I had out here as the professor of social cohesion from University of Oxford a month ago. And in fact, I'm talking to Harvey in half an hour's time at the end of this call again, because he's a person I work with. He's got a book coming out next month, which the Listener writes about, called Inheritance. And what it's about, in the last third of that book, is actually how do we get to have that common accepted narrative at the higher level that you were alluding to in your last comments, Jack, to create that unifying narrative around which people, whether they're communitarian or individualistic, whether from the left or the right, can all buy into, and therefore see it's in their self-interest to act collectively, not just within their community, but globally.
Thank you, Sir Peter. I think it's possibly Robin now, next.
Could I just say that we do have a couple more questions in the chat, so if we can make sure to fit those in, that would be great too.
All right. After Robin, we could have one from the chat. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for that, Pat, and thank you, Sir Peter. I think I noticed on one of your early slides that you talked about the end of the nation state, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and what your thinking is around that.
Well, I don't want to be too self-centered, but one of the things I work on with a colleague from the United States who used to be Secretary Kerry's science advisor is the whole issue of science diplomacy. And what we're seeing at the moment is that the Westphalian system, that's the system that was developed after the Treaty of Westphalia, I think in 1780 or whatever it was, which is the basis of how we work now with nation states as the point of governance, as nation states defined by territory with recognized boundaries, is weakening. We've seen in the case of Ukraine, recognized national boundaries are not being recognized. I mean, clearly right through the 19th century, in Europe, they were mucked up lots of times. But we've also seen the rise of the super technology power that ignores the nation state. I mean, if you think about the big platform companies, they largely put a finger, or raise a finger to the nation states over rights to taxation, etc., etc., etc. And without making a political comment whether it's right or wrong, if you think of the actions of Elon Musk in the early Ukraine period, he ignored the interests of the United States government when he's turned off Starlink so the Ukrainians could not use it. Here was an individual with power to override the interests of the nation state he worked in. Without going into the details, there are nations that I have worked with and advised who are very concerned at what point do people's loyalties move from the jurisdictional country to a virtual entity. And that is something that some countries are taking very seriously. And again, without making a political comment at all, you could look at North American politics in the moment and say that certain people have a cult-like approach to a social media-driven phenomena. So there are some really interesting issues here about how, and it's compromising a lot of thinking about how multilateralism is going to evolve.
Thank you.
It's really hard, and I don't want to be scary because I think at the end of the day, boundaries, nation states will exist, but their relative power is shifting at the moment because of the digital world.
Right. Now, Tim, you're going to read one of the chat questions.
I should note, before I do that, I should note Paul's had his hand up for a while and may in fact be going to ask the question he posted in the chat. But the next one in the chat is from Matthias Otto, and it asks, are you aware of any country's government structure that is doing better in terms of long-term thinking and non-partisan form of governance?
Well, yes and no. Long-term thinking it tends to be the function more barely prepared in countries that are effectively single-party states. Now, they may have the semblance of democracy like Singapore or the Welsh government, for example, which has always been a Labour government and perhaps will always be a Labour government. There they tend to have abilities to think 10, 20, 30 years into the future, because they're not thinking about whether they while they do have elections, they're not challenged in the way their system works. I think you can see in Rwanda something similar evolving in that way. Now, I'm not a great favour of diminishing democracy in that way, but I think you can see in those situations that the tension between the democratic process and long-term thinking is actually quite real. So where you see better long-term thinking is where countries know that where governments know they'll still be in power, irrespective of the electorate, in the next for long term.
A very interesting answer indeed. Are we now having Paul? Yes.
Oh, thank you, Peter, for the interesting discussion. You have acknowledged that climate is just a symptom of overshoot. I wonder whether sometimes just concentrating on climate is a mistake. There's so many co-benefits for dealing with other issues which also reduce emissions, but National is discarding all emission controls on vehicles. But in the last few years, we've come to realize that 2,000 people die every year from vehicle emissions from nitrous oxide and particulates, bringing on respiratory diseases and cancers. And then, of course, there is a climate impact of the carbon dioxide from vehicles. But why is there so little interest in protecting our health, both short-term and long-term? And this also applies to shifting to active modes like cycling and walking. But we don't, there doesn't seem to be any recognition or any real publicity given to these figures. We have a lot of publicity about the number of people that die from accidents, which is 200 or 300, but there's 10 times that number that die from the emissions from those vehicles. It sort of seems rather incongruous to me.
Yeah, I think again, it's a long answer to what is a really complex question underneath that, Paul, about political dynamics, about the relationship between public health and medical health, which are often traded off against each other, but they actually are very different phenomena. It's about the nature of communication on these issues and on risk, which comes back to the issues I've talked about before. And it comes to perceptions which are short-term. I've used these terms communitarian and individualistic intentionally, because I don't want to label it around political parties. But obviously, people from the right end of the spectrum tend to think about things in terms of individual responsibility. People from the left end tend to think about things from the collective responsibility. And that leads to a whole lot of dynamics of communication and so forth that enter it. Look, I can't answer the question about why people make choices. Is this driven by polls or whatever else? I have no idea. I think about the particular issue and about emissions controls, and I don't know, for instance, where it comes from within the coalition dynamics, which are always complicated. I think what you can say, however, is that public health itself has got a communications problem. Public health has, over time, tended to preach rather than to work with communities in a way that gets them to drive the demand for change. And I'm not criticizing any particular individual, but I think there's been a communication problem here, which is quite deep. And we saw that in the vaccine story. We've seen it over the obesity story. We've seen it over a lot of issues. A lot of people don't like to be told what to do. And therefore, it's how you actually communicate where they make their own decision that it's the right thing to do it. And that's got lost in public health communication with some people.
Thank you. Jane, you've had your hand up for a while. Jane? Jane, have you? Yeah.
I mean, just to finish that, you could see that in the vaccine mandate issue. Many of the people that oppose the mandate would have still gone off and got vaccinated. They just need to be persuaded and told and explained to them how they can make their choice to be vaccinated. And again, I mean, although I'm a great fan for the vaccine mandates, don't get me wrong, I think if we understand what happened in that situation, we've got to deal with the psychology of people that leads them at the moment not to trust others. The default position in New Zealand in the last trust survey is more than 50% of people don't trust the elites in society. So you're starting with the fact that the default position is distrust. Again, it's in the papers on social cohesion I referred to informedfutures.org.
Thank you. Back to you, Jane.
Thank you. That was very much, Sir Peter, what I was sort of wanting to talk about, and that was that there would be this cumulative effect with these crises. You might have a good response initially, like with the Christchurch airport, with this, the student army and all sorts of social cohesion opportunities, and the same with COVID, with the lockdowns. People were generally going along with that. But you say that the vaccine issue is huge for some people. So with your future looking, do you think if we have more pandemics or even any natural disaster that's really far-reaching for New Zealand, it's difficult if people don't want to be told what to do, isn't it? How do you create social cohesion in those situations?
There are ways of telling people what to do without telling them what to do. It's about bringing them into the discussion, it comes back to, we talk a lot in New Zealand about recognising Mātauranga Māori, recognising other knowledge systems other than science in our dialogue. It's the same discourse. Everybody lives with multiple knowledge systems, and we need to recognise that and bring why are people not trusting of a vaccine mandate? It's because they were not given the choice to understand that it was safe by trusted people. And again, the crisis of the moment is there are relatively few people who've sustained trust. Fortunately, in New Zealand, scientists are still the most trusted individuals in the country. And so there are opportunities in New Zealand that may not exist in other countries where trust in science has collapsed. You only have to look at the trust surveys in New Zealand to see how vulnerable institutions can be to the loss of trust. So, for example, police, who when I was younger were probably one of the most trusted organisations in New Zealand, have seen a huge collapse in trust, largely, I suspect, because they were involved in maintaining the mandates around the lockdowns and everything else. And people have transferred that to saying no longer the police a trusted body. So that there's been a huge collapse in trust in the police in New Zealand. And that's very worrisome.
Sally has a question in the chat. Pat, did I put that on next?
Yes, I was going to ask you, yes.
So Sally asked, do you know if the concept of a cross-party MPs group, similar to the Population and Development Committee on Climate Adaptation, is being seriously considered by Simon Watts, who's the Minister for Climate Change?
I wouldn't know. I mean, I don't get involved in those sorts of, I'm no longer in the Chief Science Advisor, so I don't have that sort of knowledge in front of me. I think, I think that, and if I can make a comment from the outside, we're still in the pendulum swinging phase as a result of the last election, because there was a manifest shift in policy settings in the last government and changes again now. That will settle very soon, I would think. I think that we're beyond that acute phase almost, I guess, I hope. And then I think we'll see, as there was when Todd Mueller was there and James Shaw was on the other side, I think you'll start seeing, again, once beyond the most acute phases, discussions starting to merge again. For instance, there's a cross-party group on artificial intelligence, which is a great thing, that there are a number of, that's the only group I know anything about at the moment, but there are cross-party groups that do work. It's just that we've got to get through the immediacy of the election change, which has led to a manifest change in which parties are in power.
Thank you. I think that's.
I'm optimistic. Sorry, I'm optimistic in general. I'm not a partisan politician, but I'm optimistic that once things settle, we'll start to have a better track towards the long term again.
I would like to finish by picking up your comment about scientists being the most trusted group in society. And
in New Zealand.
In New Zealand, yes, okay, understood, in New Zealand. And I will hold that up against the decisions made already by the current government to cut funding for the Climate Commission by a quarter. There are decisions which they are making which seem to ignore science when, as you have said and we know, the data is so clear. But you have reminded us that the picture is very complex, and thank you for elucidating its complexity. I think there aren't any more questions. There was a hand up, Jack, or is that just that you haven't?
Yes, no, I do have another question.
Well, if I could just comment on that last comment of yours, Pat, before Jack asks his question.
Yes.
As some of you know, I chair a review of the future of New Zealand science and innovation system, and a second review on the future of the higher education system, which Cabinet approved a few months ago to do. one of the terms of reference in that review, which I am not taking lightly, is the government's own use of evidence, data, science, and technology. And I assure you that the panel which I chair is taking that, which is one of the 4 core terms of reference, very seriously. I can't say what we're going to say because we haven't really worked that out yet, but you might imagine what I might say. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. The last question is therefore from Jack, because Sir Peter has to be well clear by 9. Thank you, Jack.
Very good. Oh, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, I wanted to come back to the issue of the magnitude of the polycrisis that we face, which you earlier alluded to. And in particular, I mean, there are many facets to it, as you outlined. I appreciate your comment on the perspective that the ecological component is of the highest priority, because if we don't get that right, all of the other issues about social cohesion and justice and the common good are not going to be terribly relevant, because we'll be headed toward ecological collapse. And that seems to be the trajectory that we're on. Hopefully we can avoid it, but if we continue as we are, it seems to me that that's where we're going.
Well,
And if I may just add another component to that, and that is that it seems driven by, in large part, both the ecological and social challenges that we have are driven by the economic model that has taken over, where we have an extractive model that prioritizes profit above all else. And the current government is articulating that very well, and produces waste that the biosphere simply can't absorb. And if we don't deal with that economic model to change that, the ecological trajectory, it seems to me that we're in for some very, very rough rides.
Well, I was going to interrupt you and just say that's why I put right on the 2nd or 3rd slide the economic costs of climate change, because I actually believe arguing the economic argument is going to be key to getting change from those who are dominating the political sphere in Europe, for example, at the moment, and elsewhere, elsewhere. And I think that at the end of the day, I'm reminded of something that was Gareth Morgan said at the Transit of Venus meeting, and I think it was 2014. That was the meeting held in Gisborne and Tolaga Bay at the last Transit of Venus, and Paul Callaghan put it together. In the end, I had to run it because Paul was sadly dying, and he asked me to take it over. And on the last day, there was a workshop or a seminar on environmental issues. And Gareth, who can talk bluntly, to say the least, when there was a debate going on, at the end of the day, he said something that I think is unfortunately real. Come on, look, get real, he said. If you're down to your last dollar, are you going to spend it on food, or are you going to give it to Greenpeace? Now, he wasn't being rude. He wasn't being silly. He was trying to make the point that whether we like it or not, we have to find an economic way through this, as well as an ecologically safe way through it, which is why you may be right about models. I'm not an economist, and I don't want to go down that subject I don't understand. But why I come back to this, that the fact that you've got to look at this balance between these different dimensions of sustainability, those which meet our needs. I'm not going to say hedonistic needs, but needs and our wishes, and those which are extractive, and how in the middle we use the different tools of balance to get it right. And climate is one of the readouts of that balance. And that's the hard issue. And why I put economics right at the front of my argument, not because I'm an economist, not because I'm a growth at all costs free marketeer or something like that, but because I understand that if we're gonna get this to work at the political level, we have to find the economic arguments that will work for everybody. And that's the hardest bit of this discussion, actually. I think while intellectually understanding climate change is easy to achieve, doing something about it requires us finding ways to address this more complex set of issues that you've alluded to in your question, Jack, and I poorly answered in my response, but trying to highlight what I think is the dynamics that plays away in the global and national politics of all of this.
Thank you. I see, Francis, I had said Jack would be the last person. There are about 2 minutes. Have you got time to listen to Francis's very quick question?
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. And I'm reminded of something Rebecca McPhee said in a lecture last year. There are no outsiders in today's crises. I was going to ask, or perhaps it will be made clear on the 9th of July, but what ways can sort of the civic support this exciting work for whatever your reveal is around a method in Aotearoa to deliberate on these very difficult issues.
Well,
or hopefully that will be clear. Yeah.
It will be clear, but I'll be blunt, Francis. We're trying to do it without, I mean, we're going to ask a number of individuals who are in a position to help to make donations to support it, because I don't want it to be owned by anybody. I don't want it to go to commercial sponsorship. I don't want it to be seen to be biased. There's certain needs. Yes, it can have a service function as we have. I mean, for some of you may know, we've done work, for instance, for Auckland Transport on their future needs, how they deal with their issues. I think the most interesting one was the work we did for water care, Auckland Water Care, and I'll finish there. I'll give you a minute extra, Pat. They wanted to know that what would be the next source of water that Auckland needed. And they basically discounted one option, but they had options around dams, options around trying to get more water from the Waikato River, around desalination. And they came to Koitu and asked Koitu to run a citizens' assembly on what should be the next source of water for Auckland. Now, the important thing about a citizens' assembly is you treat them like you would treat a jury. You put all the evidence they need in front of them, but you try, in the case of citizens' assembly, not to bias it. We did that, and they came up recommending the very solution that the bureaucrats had discounted as saying the public wouldn't accept, recycling of wastewater. And now they're thinking at Water Care about recycling of waste. They had discarded it because they'd assumed the public wouldn't accept recycled wastewater into their water supply. In fact, when the public were taken, or the Citizens' Assembly of, I think it was 100, not 150 people, because I didn't run it, it were taken through, they ended up changing the bureaucrats' minds about what the public would take. And I think that's what a good Citizens' Assembly does. It provides the information which might get beyond the biases, which are genuinely held and appropriately held. I mean, you can understand why officials might come to the view the public may not accept wastewater recycling. But when it was tested, the public would accept it. And that's what a good Citizens' Assembly or a good deliberative democracy does. It explores the issues in ways that make, like a jury is given all the evidence, you give people all the evidence in a way that they can respect and understand, and not treat them in a patronized way.
Great, thank you. that was a good question to finish with, and of course, the good answer. So thank you for your extra minute or two, and we wish you well for July the 9th. We will have it in our minds, if not in our diaries. So thank you very much, and thank you, Tim, for your hosting us on your Zoom account. All right, look for this recording on the website of ourclimatedeclaration.org.nz. Good night.